Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Really glad that you could join us. Topic today is building your annotation team for the data design life cycle. Pretty excited about this one. I think it's going to be a really interesting topic and really helpful. Before we jump into the webinar, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The first of which is that today's webinar is being recorded. So after the webinar, we will send, within a couple of days, we'll send you an email with a link to go and view the video. So that's the first item. And then the second item is that we will have some time at the end of this for Q&A. So, if you've got questions as you hear Erin talk, feel free. There's a Q&A widget at the bottom in your Zoom, like your Zoom toolbar. Feel free to drop your questions in there, but I'll also be keeping an eye on the chat if you put questions there as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our guest really quickly. So Erins Schliem is he's the head of AI solutions. He runs AI solutions at Welocalize, which is one of the super agencies in the language services industry. There we go. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible. But anyway, he is very knowledgeable on these topics, has a ton of experience to share, and I think is going to be super helpful. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Erin and let him take it away. So go ahead, Erin.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Hi, everybody. Even though I can't see you, thanks for being here. I'm going to just share my screen quick and get this deck up. So bear with me for just a moment. And here we go. All right. I'm going to assume that you all can see the deck just fine. So as Nate said, I'm Erin. I am a solutions architect at Welocalize. I come from the language services industry, and I've been in that industry for a very, very long time. I've worked with data also for a very long time, kind of before there really was a machine learning industry. I used to work on things like, the T9 predictive text system, or working with some of the big tech companies on, building algorithms around, search results, spell check rules. So think more rules-based, algorithm-based things, not so much machine learning, but obviously now we have entered full force into the machine learning era. At Welocalize, I've been there for about 3 years, and presently I'm doing solutions for AI. Previously, I also led the operations group for AI data, and that includes, for the language services industry, really large crowds of workers. So one thing that's unique about my perspective, and that you'll see reflected in my talk today, is a reality in the language services industry that is, not any one person really can be the subject matter expert, because we regularly work in like 50 different languages, and there's just nobody who speaks all the languages. So in order to do proper data annotation, you really need to pull together networks of linguists, people who are specialized in different areas, and that creates some really unique challenges, especially when you're working at scale. Welocalize is a big company, so we have global operations, teams all over the world. And then we also have a, sort of a standard set of engineering and technology workers, including IT, devs, data scientists, data engineers, et cetera. The kinds of work that we do as a language company typically revolve around machine translation. That's the most traditional kind of machine learning that we do. And we still do some labeling work for that, where we'll look at annotation of best results from MT engines. We do a lot of work around language models, and so chatbots and virtual assistants, and building language models for different domains. We do knowledge extraction, so taking large text data sets or audio data sets and trying to annotate them so that we can better summarize or create key observations based on the text that's available. Search and discovery, very common, whether that's product discovery, knowledge discovery. And then large language models is another part of our work, which is really emerging now and kind of a hot button topic. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right in here. Actually, one more slide. Welocalize, just to give you the full picture of Welocalize as a company. We are, like Nate said, one of the top 5 super agencies in the world around language services, meaning we really cover pretty much every language in the world, a really wide array of services, from translation and localization to multilingual marketing, digital marketing, to event services, to AI data, which is where I focus a lot of my energy. Yeah, we're a great company, and check us out if you're interested in talking more about language services. So the talk today is really about imagining how you build a successful data pipeline at scale by addressing the right kinds of people to be a part of the mix and the right process. So I thought it'd be helpful to think first about the overall life cycle of building data. Often it's tempting to just think about data itself and what are we going to do with the data. It's very exciting to feed data into a model, retrain it, and see what kind of results you get. But often I think people lose sight of the bigger picture, which is, first of all, there needs to be a target, right? What are we solutioning for? What's the business problem? If we don't know what we're solutioning for, it's really easy to get off target with the data. Then there's data design. We need to be, and I like to think about data in terms of the shape of the data. So we need to be really specific and really clear about the shape that data needs to take, so that when we design the data labeling experience, we're doing that correctly. When we're designing the training and the documentation for the workforce, we're doing that correctly. And then so that when the data scientists are actually using that data, they know what they're ingesting and they have a reasonable hypothesis of how that is going to affect the model. The last piece of all of this is the annotation, and sometimes we want to jump straight to that piece. But the annotation has its own specific things beyond just getting the work done that really need to be taken into consideration, especially when you're working at scale, as we do at Welocalize, across many, many different languages. Or if you don't work in the language industry, think about it as sort of subject matter areas or sub areas of a particular domain. So jumping in with the solution phase of this, it's really important to think about the reality of where you're at. We don't create models, we don't label data just for the sake of doing it. We do these things so that we can solve a business problem. If you don't know what the business problem is, it's probably worth digging into that question with your team to determine what is it that we're actually trying to deliver here. And that needs to be aligned with what your strategic objectives are as a company and what your product vision is. So typically, these models are part of a product that you're delivering to the market or that you're using internally to affect your own efficiencies. So, you need to make sure that you're clear on what those objectives are, so that then ultimately the work that you're doing is going to solve a problem and not just create a result. Another thing to think about when you're at this solutioning stage is the availability and the quality of existing data. So often organizations will have data available that they really just not harnessed. And what I mean by that is, it may be worth considering whether you already have a lot of the data that you need, or maybe do you have the raw material that you're going to need in order to then label or annotate that data. If not, you may need to create data, collect data from scratch. If you do have data, are there going to be some cleanup tasks that need to happen? Do you need to have an engineer go through and really clean the data that you do have so that when you load it in for annotation, that is going to be a seamless experience? And then the last piece here is really thinking about the high level flow of data. So there are often, and this is really me putting on my solutions hat, and that is thinking through, hey, how are you most efficiently going to move data between different systems so that you can minimize the amount of human work required to complete the entire cycle of from launch to retraining and a model and testing it. I like to think also about who needs to be a part of these conversations at each phase. So when we're imagining this solutions phase, there's a few people that I have noted here that are useful to have as a part of the conversation. Product manager, really important person in this. They are going to be part of that. They're going to have a perspective on where you're going, where you're driving the particular product so that it is going to meet your business objectives. Marketing managers is looking at it from a similar lens, but they're going to say, hey, okay, great. If we have this product, how are we going to be able to sell it? Are we going to be able to use this particular enhancement to the product to be able to sell more or to be able to open up some new markets? So they need to be a part of that conversation. A solutions architect is great at doing this. That's really the key role of a solutions architect, is to think about business problems and to translate those into technical initiatives that can deliver value. And then the last piece is obviously the data scientists and the people from your ML ops team. They need to critically be a part of this because ultimately it's their experiment that we're running, or the data that they need to feed into their model that we're going to be delivering. So once we've figured out what the overall solution needs to look like, we want to dig into the task and the data design phase. And I really want to emphasize how important this phase of the process is. Before you get to annotation, if you don't have a really clear idea of how you're designing this data set and how you're going to set up the task for the worker, for example, in Label Studio, you really may find yourself with a lot of headaches down the road once you get to the actual data annotation process. So some of the things that you really need to be thinking about to set yourself up properly for success are things like the tagging ontology. So I have seen many, many times where tag sets get changed midstream, or a client may deliver to us a set of tags that they want to be applied to some text. And we'll start looking at the guidelines and we'll say, hey, actually, there's two tags here that really just mean the same thing. Is that really what you want? How are we going to differentiate those two things? And very often when we go back to those data science teams, they say, oh yeah, I guess we hadn't really thought about that. So it's incumbent on you, if you are designing this work, to really think carefully about every edge case, about every possible way that some human being could break your rules or misunderstand your rules, or, as I said, misunderstand your ontology for the tagging. In the language services industry, this is even more complex because depending on the language, you may need to have variations in the way that you set up your tag set or your other data collection guidelines based on the particulars of how one language works or how a particular culture works. So again, this is unique to the domain that I work in, but I think there's a lot of parallels between the language variety, language industry, and just subject matter variety, where perhaps in your industry, you have, let's say you work in life sciences and you have 10 different kinds of life sciences specializations within which then you need to be able to label data. Some of the same questions apply. I can't emphasize enough how important really clear, unambiguous guidelines are. And to do that, a really good technique is providing contrastive examples. I would say that probably the greatest weakness that I see in many companies, and this includes, some of the biggest players in the world, is their inability to clearly express how guidelines ought to be applied. If you as the client, or if your client cannot communicate to you as the person who is doing the work, how exactly they expect the tags to be applied, you're really going to struggle to do that at scale with a group of annotation workers. And ultimately, that's going to result in inconsistent data that is not going to be as powerful for training your models as it could be. Contrastive examples are amazing. It's one thing to say how something should be. It's more effective to say, here's how it should be, and here are 3 examples of how it should not be, how you should not apply this. So I just want to bring that to the fore, because the more kinds of contrastive, here's how and here's not how to do it, the more examples that you provide like that, the more likely your annotators are going to be to truly understand what you're trying to achieve and be consistent in how they apply those labels. The last piece is really thinking about the UX of the annotation process. So it's very easy, and this is true of any UX work. It's really easy for one person or a small group of people to have a hypothesis or a sort of a mindscape of how an actual user, in our case, an annotator, is going to experience an interface, right? It's more effective to bring those people into the conversation. So to kind of bridge over to the brainpower section here of the right people, to get that right kind of perspective, it's really useful to bring together your full team to discuss what does the task design look like. In particular, the Label Studio task designer who is setting up these actual projects in Label Studio, but then also bring in your senior annotators, bring in the people that you trust the most. And I say senior annotators because we work with really large teams of annotators. You may have a very small group. Maybe there's 3 people in your company who do annotation, but those people should be a part of the conversation when you're looking at prototypes for how you're going to collect this data, because they're going to be really well positioned to tell you, hey, the ergonomics of that are going to be really hard for me. It's going to take me 25% longer to do this work compared to this other way of setting it up. So I think collaboration while you're setting up the UX, or like I said, the Label Studio project, is a really effective technique. The other people that you want to have involved, again, are data scientists. They're involved all the way through this. Ultimately, they need to know that whatever shape this data is going to take, right? And the shape of the data is defined in many ways by the guidelines that you write. They need to be 100% sure that that shape of data is going to be effective for them, that they're going to be able to ingest that, use that data to get a result. Your data engineers are important people to have here. They are the ones that are going to be transforming this data set. So, maybe what you get out of Label Studio is not exactly the format that you need it to be in, and those engineers will be well positioned to help you think through from the start, not after the data is already ready, but while you're still designing the task, while you're still designing the data structure, what work is going to be involved if you make those decisions in getting that data ready for ingestion by your data scientists. The last piece here, and this is again sort of unique to our universe, but is the computational linguists. If you don't work in language, imagine that as a subject matter expert, somebody who really knows what they're talking about when it comes not necessarily to data. They don't have to be machine learning experts, but they do have to be people who can think about data effectively and apply their own subject matter expertise to data thinking. It's a tough mix of skills to find. If you do find those people, hold on tight, because they are, a gem. They are ultimately the people who can bridge the gap between reality, what is the actual end result of this data, or how is it applied to problem solving, and the data structure itself and how your users are going to experience that in the annotation process. And the last piece here is around how you scale the pipeline for data. So we've already looked at solutioning. What is the problem we're trying to solve? How are we going to design that experience, both in terms of the data structure and in terms of the task itself? And now we need to do the work, right? We need to get data collected. Again, bringing back here the perspective that in the universe I live in, we have a lot of workers and necessarily a lot of different subspecializations. particularly languages, specific languages and specific cultures that people have experience in. Some of the things to think about when you're building out a pipeline of annotation workers, and again, I think a lot of these things can be applied at smaller scale if you have, let's say, just an internal team of annotators. Some of this same thinking can be applied. First, how are you going to qualify the workers? How are you going to determine who is going to be effective at this kind of work? I really highly recommend aptitude testing. And it doesn't mean doing the exact task, but it means, an ability to attend to details. If you are annotating, let's say, an audio file, right? And you need the timestamps on the WAV file to be within, 10 milliseconds. That's a pretty high degree of detail that somebody needs to be able to prove that they can do to you. They don't necessarily have to understand every detail of the kind of annotation task that you'd like to perform, but it is useful to make sure that they actually have the basic aptitudes so that they are likely to be successful. The next item here is this idea of trade-offs on demographics, and I want to explain that a little bit further. There's no such thing as a perfect annotator. Some people have more subject matter knowledge. Some people have less subject matter knowledge, but are really effective at the mechanics of applying tags. Some people are just fast learners. There's a lot of things that you can value in the way that an annotator works. And sometimes you have to make trade-offs. So an example from our universe is sometimes we have projects where what we need is an ability to understand chat language, right? Texting language. There may be age demographics there, and this is not meant to be an ageist comment, but there are, you may find that there are some younger workers who really are the people who are defining what is current texting language. That's just a reality of our culture globally. And some older workers may not know how that texting language works. So you may look at that and make different kinds of decisions. So one decision you might make is, hey, we really need every person on this to be very, very skilled at what we consider to be standard texting language. So you may make some trade-offs where maybe the workers have less experience, but know more about the specific subject matter. You might also make some decisions that say, hey, we are conscious that this other demographic, whether it's an age demographic or any other kind of demographic, maybe they're not actually the people driving how text language works, but they're using the systems. They are legitimate users. Hence, we need to have their way of thinking about this reflected in the data as well. Otherwise, you're going to have sort of a monolithic data set that's going to then drive a relatively monolithic model. So you just need to think carefully, I think, about the life experiences of the workers and make sure that that is reflective of either the specificity or the variation that you need to be reflected in the data itself. Humans are humans, and they will necessarily reflect themselves and their life experiences in the data that they're providing to you. So think about that before you set them loose on the data. Again, when you're working at scale, there's a lot of economics that are at play. You obviously want to get the most work done in the shortest period of time and still maintain a level of quality in the data. So it's important before you launch work to get really clear with yourselves around how much effort is legitimately required to perform the tasks. And again, this is true whether you have internal salaried employees doing annotation or if you are outsourcing this to gig workers. it's important to have an expectation of what is a reasonable throughput. Part of that is, like I said, economic in nature, especially if you're looking at, large scale crowd work. You want to make sure that the compensation that you're offering is reasonable. But you also want to make sure that people are not underthinking or overthinking tasks. And what I mean by that is that there's a tendency to do both of those things. A worker might be too fast to pass judgment or decide on which tag applies here. And that can cause mistakes, or it can cause an inaccurate reflection of what they actually see in the universe. In other cases, people can really overthink the question. And we see this really quite a bit in linguistics. Sometimes what you need is a gut reaction from a worker, and not if it's a 30-second task, you don't need somebody to spend 15 minutes doing research on it. So think about the level of effort, calculate it, and then help provide some guideposts to your workers to say, hey, this should only take a minute. If you get to 2 minutes and you're really struggling with it, skip it, or make your best judgment. But if you don't provide that kind of feedback to your workers, you might find that people are wasting time by thinking too much or not putting enough effort into contemplating the right answers. Another piece that's really challenging in pipeline management or workforce management, as it were, is just getting engagement from workers. Sometimes annotation can just be a really monotonous process. And you really need to think carefully about what are the motivations for your workforce to do a great job on this, and what are the techniques that might allow them to be more engaged or more effective. You can think about things like, and I'm hesitant to use the word, but gamification. I think maybe before AI, gamification was our thing that everybody loved to talk about. But there is some real merit to thinking about humans' competitive spirit and people's need to be recognized and to achieve, and playing on that when you're trying to get engagement from workers. So whether that's a badging system or incentives to workers, if you complete X amount of data in X amount of time with Y degree of quality, we'll give you a bonus, etc. So think about those kinds of things as you're setting up your system, because it's a lot worse to find yourself in a poorly performing annotation pipeline and then try to determine how you're going to get engagement. You're much better off planning for engagement from the start rather than responding to low engagement. And I pretty much can guarantee you that it's going to be planning for low engagement, not planning for over engagement. The other things to think about here are just some of the administrative pieces of managing a pipeline of workers or a crowd of workers. One piece is just how are you going to handle bad data and how are you going to handle offboarding of people? So again, it's very important to be clear about these things up front before you bring workers into your world. It's good to let them know what your expectations are. That has to do with some of the things we've talked about before around good guidelines, good training materials, good incentives to do good work. But then also being clear about what does bad look like and where is the line? What are your techniques? What are your expectations? What are you going to do if you're seeing bad data? So to do that, you need to know how are you going to see the bad data? What constitutes poor performance over time? And then what are you going to do about that? Are you going to have a model whereby you say, hey, if we see this particular pattern, we're going to retrain you, and then we're going to do some sort of hypercare monitoring of your performance over a period of time? Or are you going to have a model that just says, hey, if you fail this many times, you're out, and we're going to automatically remove you from the system? Whatever that is, you want to be really tight on that, because if you need to remove workers from your pool, you're going to want to remove them now in the moment that you discover it. Otherwise, you're just accumulating bad data. And it is not easy, if you've accumulated bad data, to later on find the few things that are bad with the data and try to fix them. Now, granted, I think in a lot of collections, it's okay to have some degree of bad data, but you always want to minimize that. And so one of the things that you can do to help minimize that is having a clear plan for how you're going to identify workers who are producing bad data and how you're going to offboard them from the system. So think about that ahead of time. And then the last thing that I wanted to address here was really about payment mechanics. This is really more related to crowd workers or freelance workers, not so much to salaried workers. But think through how you're going to deliver the payment reward to your workforce. Workers tend to want fast payment. They want reward right now for the things that they're doing. And that can be one of the things that allows you to get better engagement from the workforce. But again, those kinds of things are not easy to solve midstream. You don't want to be thinking after you've launched work, how are you going to quickly be able to get payments to people? So plan for those things ahead of time. The brainpower group that's going to help to solve these problems is going to include the community manager. So the person who really is handling this group of workers and how you're getting them engaged, how you're onboarding, offboarding, training, communicating with that group of people. Really a critical role when you are trying to do this work at scale. You also have then obviously the annotation workforce. That's the group that's the community that they're managing. Included in this is still the Label Studio task designer. This person is going to be critical to understanding how is this project evolving, learning while you move through this project so that you can iterate and do a better job on future task design. You're going to have data engineers as a part of this. They're going to help you think about, for example, the bad data problem. What are you going to do? How are you going to find that data? What are you going to do with that data? And then the computational linguists. Again, these folks are really helpful in helping you to understand, and again, this is our particular use case around language. It could be some other kind of subject matter specialist, but helping think through what's the right profile for a worker to be able to deliver knowledge, deliver observations for a particular subject matter, whether it's a language, a culture, or some other specialty. You want to have those subject matter specialists as a part of your planning process because they are going to be well positioned to help inform your decisions about how you set this up. So if we get all of these pieces in place, what we're looking for is really a virtuous cycle where we define a business problem during the solutioning phase. We create the right team structure for addressing those problems. We collect good data, again, as a result of this three-step process. That data improves our models. We get better product performance as a result of that. And again, product could be an externally facing product that you sell. It could be an internal product that you use to enhance your margins or satisfaction internally. And you get a better business outcome as a result. And that circles back to a new business problem. How are we going to do more of this? Or maybe this has opened up a whole new area of problem solving. So this is the virtuous cycle that we want to enable through the process. And with that, what questions do we have? I think I just saw something pop up here.
Yeah, perfect. So thanks so much, Erin. Just fantastic information. And to your point, we have a couple of minutes now for some questions and some Q&A here at the end. So if you see down at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A widget. So feel free to drop your questions in there. We'll be watching that. But yeah, we do have some questions in the queue. So the first one is, do you have any suggestions on how to detect bad data? Like, I imagine it depends on the project, but are there any general good practices or standard processes to help with that?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the kind of data that you want to that you're handling. So for example, I think one of the best ways that our team addresses that is by developing some gold data before we launch the project, and then interspersing gold data in with the normal tasks that people perform. So by doing that, what we allow is we have an ability to then match up and say, okay, well, we know the right answer. We know what we believe the right answer is for X percentage of the data. Our workers don't know, they don't need to know if they're performing a real task or a sort of a gold data quality management task. And then by doing that, we can look at performance against gold data as a standard and then extrapolate from there. We make an assumption that if a worker is doing badly with the gold data tasks where we know that the answer, they're probably not doing great on the tasks where we don't know what the right answer is. So I think that's a technique that we found to be really successful. The challenge there is defining what is gold data. How do you define what the right answer is from the start? But ultimately, if you can't, it's kind of a good sanity check as well. When you think about your own guidelines and your own expectations for the data. So I think you get double value out of the data, out of gold data. Not only are you able to use it to measure effectiveness of annotators, but it also forces you to have really hard conversations internally about why is this the right answer versus this other answer. And it will drive you to see some nuances that you probably would not have noticed in just writing the guidelines in the first place.
Awesome. Yeah, that's some great advice. Cool. So another question, generative AI is super hot right now. How do you see things like ChatGPT fitting into this model that you've proposed?
That's an interesting and timely question these days, isn't it? I feel like every morning that I wake up, I see 5 ChatGPT or large language model things on my radar. What I see in this world is I don't see what's the word I'm looking for, a panacea or some just sort of easy solution to all the problems of the world. It is super impressive, don't get me wrong. I think that these are major advances. But what I see is probably a better ability for a large language model to assist in producing a hypothesis that then a human can validate or not. That already exists. That's already a capability. It's something that exists in the wild. It's a capability that Label Studio supports. But the ability to plug in a hypothesis for a particular problem and then have humans respond. And that includes annotation. So having the machine annotate for you and programmatically, and then having a human in the loop to validate that. So what I see is more efficient data labeling. I don't think that data labeling goes away. I do think that there continues to be a need for customization of different engines, even though the large language models are getting closer and closer to the right answers. The other thing I think there is, it's easy to get excited about examples of success with ChatGPT or other large language models, but that doesn't remove concerns around privacy and data protection. So if you send some data to OpenAI, what happens to that data? And that's a really big deal for a lot of companies. And for that matter, what happens when it does fail? Because the models do fail. They're not perfect, and they produce erroneous information. They produce really rather arguably grotesque bias in the way that they understand, and I use understand loosely, the way that they process the universe. is dependent on the data that they have, and the data that they have is filled with all of the biases that humans have. So it's exciting. I do think it's going to be a slower evolution as it relates to real world data management, model management. I don't think it's going to just turn everything upside down overnight. Hopefully, though, it will make our lives better by offering efficiencies in how we do some of the things that we do today, rather than just replacing them wholesale.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I think we are about at time. I don't see any other open questions at the moment. So, last call if you've got any questions for Erin, but otherwise, just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us, and really appreciate the time and effort. So, thank you very much. And just a note there, if you do have questions for Erin that come to mind after, his email address is here in the slides. And again, we'll be emailing you after this with link to the recording and some additional information so that you can get in touch with Erin or with us if you have questions about Label Studio. So